Hello.
Hello.
I'm Kodi.
I'm Matt.
We're poets.
And we're also married.
And what are we doing, Matt?
We were asked by Carrie, who is organizing Verse of April this year, to
Make a thing.
To make a thing, yeah. And she left it pretty open. So we decided that we would do an interview together.
Yeah, like a co-interview of each other. We're both poets. We both want to talk about poetry, celebrate poetry for Verse of April. Also, my secret dream is to be interviewed, and why not live that out right here and right now?
Yeah. So let's do it.
All right. Do you got a question for me, Matt?
Yeah,
Ask
I
me
do.
something.
Who are your artistic or poetic ancestors? And what do these ancestors tell you?
Okay. So I love this question. This is my question. Well, or did I steal it from Roxane Gay? I don't remember. Anyways, so I like artistic ancestors because I think when you ask people, what are your poetic influences, they tell you about other poets. And I'll do that in just a second. But when I think about, what are the artistic ancestors, to me as a maker of art, and particularly poetry, I think a lot about craft. And I mean, traditional female, craft, crochet, sewing, things that are repetitive, weaving, very pattern textile based things. I do a couple of those things, not all of them. I don't do them well, but a lot of the people in my family did those things. And so I think there's something about the tactileness of textual art that's really important to me. So when I'm thinking about what does that tell me, it tells me so much of poetry is about pattern, about repetition, about language, because language is pattern, and how you weave language together. So that's what I think about a lot when I think about who are my poetic, or my artistic ancestors. As far as particular poets go, it's people like Denise Duhamel, Naomi Shihab Nye, really who else? I don't know, Yusuf Komanyaka is someone who's really important to me, Sharon Olds, and so these are all people, they're not necessarily, they don't write like I do, and so that's interesting because I think about what they tell me. So Naomi tells me it's okay to be myself. I love Naomi's poetry because it is not concerned with being it's not trying to be the most clever poem in the room. It's not that it's not clever, it is clever. It's just it doesn't care about impressing you. It's concerned with the image, or concerned with a feeling, or concerned with what it's doing. It's telling its own sort of story. I don't mean that necessarily in a narrative way, although she does write narratively. She made me feel like it was okay to be me and to be with her when I was reading her. Denise Duhamel I love because she's funny. And she's also unabashedly female, to the point where it's one of my favorite things ever is Kinky, which is her book, which is all about Barbie. It brings me untold amounts of joy, and whenever I can, I try to get people to read it.
Yeah, you got me to read it.
You read it?
Yeah, you don't
really?
remember that?
I don't remember this.
Yeah, it's great.
I tricked you into reading Kinky.
You didn't trick me. You worked on me over a period of years. And eventually I read Kinky.
The whole thing.
And I really enjoyed it. And I thought, why didn't I read this a lot sooner?
But a lot of people make judgments about Kinky, and I think about Denise's work in general. Anyways, I love her. Because she's it's okay to be funny. It's also okay to be irreverent. It's also okay to be a little bit nasty. All these things are important to me in my work. But I don't know. I think it's your turn, Matt.
Well, before we go, do you want to say any more about some of the
other people?
Because I like that you brought up some of these artistic influences that, not necessarily just, I'm a poet, so I'm
other
only
poets
interested by poets, only interested in other poets. But
other things.
Are there other? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Fiction is a huge thing for me.
Sure.
I think it's also a big deal for you.
Oh,
you
yeah,
can talk about this in a second. But there are people in fiction like Alice Munro, Murakami is hugely important to me, and I don't even know what they tell me so much is they just they entertain me. I don't mean that in the sense of media or entertainment, or how TV entertains. Not that there's anything wrong with TV, but I'm I am intellectually stimulated, and so for me it's like okay to like feel pleasure through intellectual stimulation, and that is something that happens in fiction for me, and that I can do that for someone else. Like it's okay to like do that for other people, but it's weird because it's not like you're like setting out to write like an intellectual experience for someone. You're just like, I'm bored. How could I entertain myself with words?
Yeah, that is, to some extent, that is part of poetry. Yeah.
Anyways,
A big part of poetry.
it's your turn. Who are your artistic or poetic ancestors, and what do they tell you?
Okay, so I like that it's both artistic and poetic. So, in terms of, I guess, artistic influences or artistic ancestors, I mean, I would say that Murakami is a huge influence to me, and you stole that from me shamelessly.
I mean, you're a huge influence on my life, so
Okay. All right. Well, just as long as we acknowledge that.
that you are the originator of Murakami in
I'm
my
not,
life.
I'm not the originator of Murakami.
He
but-
introduced me to Murakami. He would like the record to show.
Okay. I mean, just to clear that up. Murakami's amazing. And who else? Who else do I love?
It's hard
I
to
mean,
say.
I don't know. I mean, I think that I really like to read widely and you know, not just focus on poetry or fiction or whatever. I mean, so Jamaica Kincaid is someone who like I really admire because she has written so much and so much that doesn't, you know, necessarily fit
My garden book,
nicely within like, you know, those sorts of categories.
i.e. my garden book.
Yeah. I mean, that's a book that like I just think is insightful, and I think it's hilarious, and I think it is. It has so much to tell me about unapologetically kind of just being the person that you are at the moment. And I think Jamaica Kincaid is just so clever and funny, but also like fearless in a way that is kind of sneaky. Like you don't even, you know, you can read through like passages of My Garden and not even really, you know, she's just talking, you know, you can kind of feel like, oh, well, she's just talking about a seed catalog and like what is so interesting about that, but it's so much deeper than that. So yeah, I mean, she's someone that I really admire. In terms of poets that I feel like are artistic ancestors, I think that Nathaniel Mackey is a huge influence, and you know, I just think that his work has so much to tell me about scope and what you can do in terms of like you know, the scope of a poetic project, or in his case, you know, he's a fiction writer as well as a poet. And I just think it's so crazy and awesome that he's kind of still writing the same poem. You know, like
Yeah.
he just like you know, a new book comes out and it's a new work, and it is you know, it's pushing his project forward, but at the same time, it's also a continuation of his entire career's work as a poet, and it's got this mythic scope, it's got this historical scope, but it also directly connects to what is going on right now, you know, and so I admire that, and I feel like he has a lot to tell me about writing that can be both kind of mythically epic and also still connected to the contemporary moment.
What would you tell someone that Mackey's just, like, who said to you, Mackey's just too hard? This is an aside, but I want to ask.
No, I think it's a good question. I think Mackey is very hard, and I think Mackey's poems are the kinds of poems where an individual, you know, an individual line or even an individual page of the manuscript may kind of just wash over you, because there's so many references, and there's, there's a cosmology to the work, and it's deeply connected to an Afro-diasporic, larger sort of cosmology, that he's drawing from, and I would say, if someone's just approaching Mackey for the first time and they're saying, this is very difficult, like, how do I deal with this, or what do I do? I would just say, just keep going and find those details that are going to pull you in, because there are little hooks of narrative that you can grasp onto. There's a we in a lot of those poems, that I think can be read in a variety of ways, but I tend to read it as a sort of contemporary, but again, like almost time traveling, group of diasporic figures, and I think the poems move through time and space, from page to page, sometimes from line to line, and I also think if you're having trouble with Mackey, enjoy the music, enjoy the music of Mackey, because that's he is so fascinated by music, and there's so much music in his poetry, and I think that it's difficult stuff, but I think find the music in the words, find something to grasp, and just hold on. So
who else are your other poetic ancestors? We got distracted, sorry.
Yeah, so I would say that Tomaž Šalamun is like...
Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, I think...
Say it again.
Tomaž Šalamun?
Okay.
I think that's how you say his name. I could be totally wrong.
We'll look it up after. We'll put a note in.
It's one of those things where unless you hear someone say his name, you maybe you don't know how to say it until you... So if I'm saying it wrong, apologies. Tomaž Šalamun is like one of my favorite poets, and I just think I admire him for his humor and his surprisingness, his intelligence, that is also very mischievous, I think that he's a playful poet, but he's also a poet who is like deeply aware of like history and deeply aware of what's going on at the moment that he's writing. And I think that he revels in that. Like because there's some poets that, write about difficult topics, and it's heavy stuff, and, that's, and in some cases that's the way you should approach it. But I kind of like that he can really make you laugh. I also really... I think he's taught me a lot about how a poet can transform over the decades that they're writing, because his early poems are so full of fun and humor, and even when they're on difficult subjects or themes, they can be very funny and very irreverent. You were talking about Denise Duhamel and her irreverency, and I think they kind of share that. But I also admire that later on, the poems in Andes, the collection Andes, for example, they are so they do such weird things with syntax and grammar, and they really are about the language. Not to say that that his other work wasn't, but the narrative kind of falls to the wayside a little bit. I mean, it's still there, but it's more about these combinations of syntactical phrases and these sorts of the logical leaps that you can make with language and what's available, using the material of language. And it's, and like I admit, I'm reading him in translation, so like I'm not getting everything, but I still just I just think he's so weird and so out there, and yeah, I just like that. Yeah, so. All right, so let's ask you a question. How do you read a book of poems?
How do I read a book of poems? This has changed a lot. I must say that before I studied poetry during my MFA, I didn't read a whole lot of like whole book-length poem books. That was something I got trained to do, or trained to say that I do. I like when I get a book of poems, like I just got, you got from the library, you got Terrance Hayes' new book of poems.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sonnets for my past and future assassin.
So you just got that book, and it's awesome. But I had not like sitting down and like reading the first poem, and then reading the second poem, then reading the third poem. I'm reading like poems like I just like read the first one, flip to the middle, read the next one. Ooh, the one next to it is really interesting. I'm gonna read that. He has a list of all the first lines in the back with the page numbers, but then those become sonnets in and of themselves, which is tricksy. So then I got distracted by that. Yeah. So I don't read linearly. I sort of read in a circle when it comes to books of poetry. I don't know if that's what you're supposed to do or not. There's some books of poetry that tend to be like more narrative, and there's like a through line, and so like it makes sense for you to read them in order. I usually discover that after I've not read them in order. I also have a tendency to be like, well, cool story, bro, you wrote a book, but I like these 4 poems. So yeah, those are the ones I'm going to read over and over again. Great. Yeah. And occasionally there'll be like a book that has like one of those 4, like I have I love the poet. Those 4 poems are their poems by like that I love. And occasionally like I'll be like trying to get to one, and then I'll discover a new one. And I'm like, oh, but why haven't I read this book all the way through? And I'm like, oh, it's because it's me. Yeah. I regret it. But so I say that to say I'm not right. What do you think? How do you go about reading a book of poetry?
Yeah, well, yeah, I have a lot of feelings about this because I have been like shamed by people, I feel like, in the past for
sporadic reading.
Maybe not me specifically, but I guess I've been in conversations where people are talking as though, when you receive a book of poems, there's a correct way to move through it. And I think that is
bullshit.
Total bullshit. Because once the poems are out in the world, and especially once they're in book form, and I can just take the book home, I can do whatever I want in terms of how I approach reading that, I tend to start at the beginning, and I tend to go along, and I mean, similar to you, I think there are certain poems in the collection that are going to really speak to me and really connect with me and be interesting to me on like a craft basis, or just I'm just going to read it and be like, that's an awesome poem. Like that poem made me laugh, or that poem made me think in a different way about something.
That poem did a ninja move. It ninja'd you.
Yeah. And I get obsessed with those poems. And so I, like you, I mean, I think I go back to those poems, and I continue to circle back to them. And so that sometimes makes it it sometimes gets in the way of me going forward in a like progressive line through the book, as though a book like that, as though a poetry book necessarily has one direction that you can go in. I think that is a ridiculous notion. So I mean, I think that whoever receives the book is going to read it in whatever way they need to read it. you know.
I also think people are reading poetry, like you said earlier, in like another conversation. More people are reading poetry right now more than ever, and I think how they're reading it is not in book form.
No,
for the
it's
most
not.
part. It's like Instagram or whatever.
Yeah, or it's like a link from Twitter, or
Yeah.
it's like, or it's the poem of the day from whatever
Poetry
website,
Foundation,
you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
So like when you talk about reading books, I think some people are like, "What do you mean?"
Yeah.
Oh man. So.
All right. So I was going to ask you.
He was going to ask
about materials. So, what are the materials that make up the poems that you write, and how do you find these materials?
And by materials, just for clarification.
So materials, I guess I mean like what do you draw on to make poems? Like,
okay, I got it.
Yeah.
I'm with you. So, I'm a librarian. We had to talk about it at some point. Every librarian likes to talk about how they're a librarian. The materials that I draw on is information, but everything is information. When you become a librarian, you spend a lot of time thinking about information. What is it? Where is it? How do you get it? Like, how do people get it? So when I'm thinking about, like what materials do I need to write a poem, I'm often thinking about texts, information, ideas, like inspiration. So, like, for example, flarf is a kind of poetry that I find very inspiring. So in flarf is terrible on purpose, and I don't quite go that far. But so one of the like flarf techniques is like you like look at it like a list of Google results, and like you take different phrases and you make a poem. So like I'll do that sometimes, but I'll look at my email or emails that I get that have like terrible like language, bureaucratic like usage of language in them, and then I'll mix that with something else. Maybe it'll be a poem or a poetry reading I'm listening to. I really like listening to poetry readings, like a nerd. So I'll listen to a poetry reading, and then I'll like be like looking at my email, and then maybe I'll have a personal experience that day, like something will happen to me that will feel whatever, and I will write a poem that like interweaves these three things. And I literally do it. I don't have a lot of time to write, and so I literally like line from here, line from there, line from here, line from there, and it's like actually like a textile like piece where all the lines are coming from a different place. So it's sort of like found text, sort of like flarf, but also that'll get revised like 4,000 times. So it'll be very different, but in order to like make the material, that clay of that poem, I'll need to draw from different information sources. And sometimes that means doing research. Sometimes I spend a lot of time on Wikipedia. I'm a librarian, so like have access to all these crazy library resources. Sometimes I'm in the OED. Sometimes I'm like using books. It just depends.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I go about hunting these things down however I can.
I mean, yeah, and we should say, I mean,
We should.
I guess I was in a class with Craig Morgan Teicher, and he used like kind of an analogy to talk about
the clay. You're going to explain clay.
The artistic process of making poems. And he talked about how like there are other forms of art that your materials are kind of already at hand. You know, like if you're a sculptor, you know, you start with the material that you're going to sculpt, and you kind of, you know, go from there. But with with literary arts, a lot of times like you have to make your own clay basically, and so you kind of start. I mean, his idea. I mean, we're borrowing this from him, but I think it's a smart way of thinking about it. You kind of start with, you make something. Clay, which is often not very polished.
And then you manipulate that into art.
And then from that you can kind of work your way into making a poem. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Because even like sculptors, like they spend time
kneading
and like getting that clay ready to turn into art.
Yeah.
And I think poetry is the same.
Yeah.
But it is now your turn.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you a question, Matt.
All right.
So when you're writing, how conscious of audience are you? Like, how often do you think, oh, well, I need to make sure that someone understands this, or like, how will this be received?
Yeah. Well, this is a difficult question. I think that I am often. I often am worried about I mean, I try not to be worried about it, but I am often worried about the idea, like, does this make sense? Is anyone going to be able to pick up on what I'm saying? But at the same time, there's a really, really strong part of me that is resistant to the idea of, that it has to make sense in some conventional way. I think that there's a lot of ways to make sense. Like there's narrative, there's a sort of grammar that you can use. There's, repetition as a way of kind of keeping things together, keeping an idea together, and I think every poem for me is a different opportunity to try something new out, and I'm much more invested in wanting to do new things and wanting to surprise myself in my poetry, and that's, I think, my primary focus, and I think really in terms of audience, I guess I don't write so much with an audience in mind, like with a particular audience in mind, because like I said earlier, like whoever sees the poem is going to read the poem however they're going to read it, and I just try to do my best to form the poem in a way that I hope whoever is reading it will see the arrows that are in the poem that are pointing to this or that. Does that make sense?
Yes, the subtext of this question is you care a lot more about punctuation than I do.
Well, yeah, I do. I do care about punctuation.
Give people the things they need to read. I'm less.
You're less
concerned.
Interested in that? Okay.
It just doesn't occur to me as something that's necessary, and then you read it and you're like, but what is it? Like, literally, how do you read this?
Yeah.
And you give me a hard time. So I think that you care about being read in terms of, like, literally, can someone read this the way that I would read it?
The way that I want them to read it. Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
Which causes me all sorts of problems.
Well, to some extent, like, that shows that, like, I kind of am a little bit of a control freak in terms of, like, wanting people to read it the way I wrote it. But I also, like, as I keep saying, like, I'm totally aware that that's not going to happen. So I just try to do my best to give them something, that is the way that I think, I want it to be read,
Yeah.
To compliment you, I think it's nice that you can be open about, whoever is going to read it, So, all right.
One last question.
So, what makes a poem interesting to you? And, another way of asking this, or maybe an additional question is, what is it about a poem that makes it good?
Oh, I think this is something that we've both touched on, or you've touched on, is like being surprised. I think that's, or being surprised, and that can happen in a variety of ways. That can happen via humor, that can happen via, like, leaping. Like, some people take these huge cognitive leaps in poems, or huge image leaps from one image to another. That can, like, in, like, the Terrance Hayes I brought up earlier, he keeps surprising me
in the new book?
In the new book, because it's like, oh, that, like, you think you know where you're at in one line, and then the next line you're like, oh gosh, like, that's not where I thought we were going. Also, clever. Like, sometimes, like, just the way that people's minds move is surprising and exciting. And I think poetry for a lot of people is like a vehicle by which you can see and attempt to feel what other people feel. Because that's the weird thing about being alive. You don't actually know what someone else means when they say they feel sad. And so poetry, I think, is a vehicle for trying to actually feel that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people write poetry for a variety of reasons, but getting giving other people that experience, that emotional experience, I think is a big part of that. So a poem is interesting to me when it surprises me, when it does something I'm not expecting. Language is often used in a variety of like terrible and boring and clinical and bureaucratic ways in my life. Like the way that people use language in my professional life is dulling. Yeah. It makes me sad a lot. So poetry for me is an escape. Literally, I was I forget his name. The poet. He's the poet laureate of Virginia. We saw him speak. What is his name? This is what happens when you record yourself live and you don't write down notes. But we'll figure it out and we'll put it in here. He was talking, we took a craft talk, and he was talking about how poetry has this wonderful ability to break you out of your everyday life. Like it can break you out of Tim's Sybils. Thanks, Tim. You're the best. His craft talk was really good. That poetry is a freeing way. I think so. I see it. Poetry is thank God I got this, so I don't have to be here in bureaucratic town with all the language police.
Yeah.
So that's when it's interesting to me. I think it's good when it's surprising, but I also think something about a poem that makes it good is it pleases me.
Well, what does that mean though?
So sometimes it surprises me, but sometimes it gives me a dramatic thrill. Sometimes it makes me laugh. I think pleasure is an underrated part of reading.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So that's what makes it good. And so that's what I mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, Matt. What do you think makes a poem interesting to you? And then additionally, or maybe simultaneously, what about a poem makes it good?
Yeah, I mean, I think that poems that really stay with me and strike me, and the poems that I love have this quality of demonstrating how language really can create new worlds. Mm-hmm. And can really create realities beyond this sort of conventional corporate one that we seem to be living more and more in every day. I think that poetry is a weird thing, and it kind of really celebrates weirdness, I think. And that weirdness is its particularity, its peculiarity, its individualness of voice or of style or of vision. And I think that is what's fascinating to me about the poems that I really like. And echoing you, I think a poem really works for me when it's surprising, when it does something I just wasn't expecting, and makes me see that there is something beyond the sort of verbal world that we live in. In our kind of everyday life.
Yeah.
I want to make this clear too. I mean, there is poetry in everyday speech. So I'm not trying to say that in everyday speech there isn't poetry. It's actually, I think good poems collect language in a way that make me go, make me think in an entirely different frame of mind, and let me see how the poet is thinking or the speaker is thinking, and that's similar to what you were saying, poetry has this quality of showing us how minds work, and you were talking about how feeling, but yeah, I mean, I think there's poetry can give us kind of an emotional map, but I think it can also give us a sort of a mental map of how someone is thinking and how someone is processing the information that they're receiving, you know. And I think those are the poems that really fascinate me.
Yeah, like a good poem is always funny because it's like you keep coming back to it, like the Taxi poem by what's his face.
The Taxi by Russell Edson. Yeah.
Like, still enjoy that poem. I know that poem. Like it's like a good song. It doesn't get old.
Yeah, and it's so that poem, which is a prose poem. I mean, Russell Edson mostly wrote a lot of prose poems, but like, it's just so it's so full of wonder. You know, like every line that follows is just, it's expanding the wonder and you know, so even though someone could read that and say, well, this is so, you know, this is so fantastic, or this is so, you know, it's not connected to reality. And I would disagree with that statement that it's not connected to reality. I think it very much is connected to reality, but I think what it's doing is it's pushing on the limitations, you know, and it's moving into a realm of wonder, and I think that's awesome. So, all
on
right.
that magical note,
Yeah.
Happy April.
Yeah, happy April. Thank you, Carrie, again for allowing us to do this. And yeah, poetry's awesome.
Go read it.
Go read it.